And it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's discussion with Shahram Mokri, a filmmaker whose work I greatly admire and whose mind-bending and time-bending film Careless Crime is included in this year's Festival of Films from Iran, which is streaming in Boston, Houston, and the Washington, D.C. area through this Sunday. I'd like to start by thanking my co-presenters of the festival, Marian Luntz and Tracy Stevenson at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, and Carter Long and Kristen Hoskins at the Department of Time and Space in Boston. I'd also like to thank Mona Kashfi for translating for Mr. Mokri tonight. And of course, special thanks go out to the ILEX Foundation for supporting this festival for so many years, and especially during this particularly challenging one. I'd also like to remind everyone that we will be having another filmmaker conversation this Saturday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern with Mona Zandi Haghighi, the director of African Violet, another wonderful film in the festival. And for those of you who don't know, as of last Friday, we've added a bonus film to the festival, Coup 53, a documentary about the MI6 and CIA-backed coup in Iran in 1953 that includes never-before-revealed archival materials. That is also streaming through Sunday. Our moderator tonight is Godfrey Cheshire. He is a New York-based filmmaker and critic whose writings about Iranian cinema have appeared in the New York Times, Newsweek, Film Comment, Sight and Sound, Cineast, Variety, RogerEbert.com, and many other outlets. He has visited Iran 7 times since the 1990s to study its cinema. He is the author of the book Conversations with Kiarostami and the forthcoming In the Time of Kiarostami, Writings on Iranian Cinema. All of us who program Iranian films owe him a debt of gratitude for all the work he's done to bring attention to Iranian cinema in the U.S., so we are very happy to have him with us tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Godfrey Cheshire.
Such a great history over the years, and it looks like a very good lineup this year. And I'm very glad to be able to talk about the film Careless Crime with its director and co-writer, Shahram Mokri, who is one of the most internationally acclaimed younger directors in Iran now, and has now made 3 feature films that have gotten a lot of attention in various parts of the world. I'm just going to invite Shahram to come into the conversation now. Hello, Shahram. It's great to see you again.
سلام گاتفری، خیلی خوشحالم که الان اینجا هستم و تو این برنامه دارم با شما صحبت میکنم و برام لحظه خیلی مهم و بزرگیه. ازتون ممنونم که منو تو این برنامه دارید.
Good evening, Godfrey. It's my pleasure to be here with you tonight and to participate in this discussion. This is a very important moment for me, and I'm very much looking forward to our discussion.
Okay, let me start by asking and talking about the burning of the Rex Cinema in Abadan in 1978, which is a real historical event. Almost everybody in Iran knows this tragedy very well. Hundreds of people died after this cinema was torched with its doors shut. But people outside Iran, I don't think, know this crime very well. So I wanted to ask you what this crime means, this famous incident means to Iranians now, and why you chose to put this in your film as a sort of a central element.
همونطور که اشاره کردید این داستان توی ایران خیلی داستان آشناییه و ما هر سال که به سالگردش میرسیم مردم ایران دوباره راجبش حرف میزنن، دوباره در مورد اون حرف میزنن و هنوز براشون سوالای زیادی وجود داره که میپرسن در مورد این حادثه و میپرسن که واقعا چه اتفاقی اونجا افتاد.
As you pointed out, this story is very familiar to the Iranian people, and every year as we approach the anniversary of this fire, the Iranian people still discuss it, and there are still many questions about that incident that are top of mind for them.
به خاطر همین این واقعه هنوز خیلی تازه است برای ایرانی‌ها، با وجود اینکه 40 سال ازش گذشته، اما دائم داره با تکرار شدنش دوباره داره مسائل جدیدی راجبش بروز میشه. همین امسال یک کتاب خیلی مهم جدید در مورد این حادثه بیرون اومد که مسائل تازه‌ای رو در موردش مطرح میکنه.
For this reason, even though the incident took place 40 years ago, it's still very fresh in the minds of the Iranian people, and it's still a point of discussion. Just this year, a new book was published that disclosed new details about the incident.
اما سینما ایران هیچ وقت به سمت داستان فیکشن بس نرفته برای ساختن این حادثه. چند مستند در موردش ساخته شده اما هیچ وقت به سمت اینکه یک فیلم فیکشن راجبش ساخته بشه هیچ وقت اقدام نکرده و کاری نکرده. من فکر کردم باید فیلمی درباره، اگر بخوام فیلمی درباره سینما ایران بسازم شاید حادثه سینما رکس بتونه مهمترین اتفاق توش باشه.
But Iranian cinema has never undertaken a fictional treatment of this incident. There have been documentaries over the year, but never a fictional depiction. That's why I thought if I was going to make a film about Iranian cinema, this central incident would be a good one to focus on.
From what I know about this incident, it's still very much debated as to who was responsible for it. I mean, from the time that it happened, there were people that said it was the Shah's people, it was the Savak that did this, and then there were other people that said, no, it was Islamists that did it, or even left-wingers. The Islamists had burned a lot of theaters in Iran, cinemas, during the time leading up to the revolution, so it would be natural that they would be suspected. But is it still unclear, or is there a consensus now in Iran as to who is responsible for this?
شاید هنوز به صورت رسمی گفته نشده باشه در هیچ کدوم از دادگاه‌ها یا در هیچ کدوم از منابع که چه کسانی پشت حادثه سینما رکس بودن. این به صورت رسمی هنوز بیان نشده.
There has been no official judgment on who was truly responsible for the fire of Cinema Rex, not within any court documents, not within any official capacity.
اما الان تقریبا در افکار عمومی اون چیزی که توی ایران آدم‌ها دیگه راجع بهش میدونن اینه که به نظر میرسه نیروهایی که اون موقع میخواستن انقلاب کنن احتمالاً آدم‌هایی بودن که بیشتر تمایل داشتن به انجام این کار، یعنی کسانی که پشت پرده این حادثه بودن.
But within the public discourse and the public perception of the incident, the consensus seems to be those who supported the revolution are most likely to have been responsible for the fire.
ولی یه نکته رو گاتفری من باید بهش اشاره کنم و اون اینه که این دو داستان، یعنی رژیم شاه یا نیروهای انقلابی کدوم یک پشت این حادثه بودن، همیشه طرفدارای بیشتری داشتن تا اینکه ما فکر کنیم این حادثه توسط چند تا آدم اتفاق افتاده. این داستان یعنی بعد سوم همیشه طرفدارای خیلی کمی داره، ولی من توی Careless Crime فکر کردم باید به این بعد سوم بیشتر نگاه کنم.
It's important for me to point out that these two narratives, that the fire was either started by the Shah's regime or revolutionaries, have been the popular theory amongst the public discourse about this incident. But we have never really delved into a third possibility, that the fire was set by individuals. And that's why I thought it was important to undertake that narrative in this movie.
That's very interesting because we have a version of the lead up to the burning of the theater in the film, but it's hard to tell who these guys are. They don't sound like they're revolutionaries. They don't sound like they're Savak agents or government agents. I assume that you wanted people to provide their own ideas to this. Is that right? Or did you have an idea that maybe I missed in watching the film as to who these guys were?
میدونید در مورد حادثه سینما رکس من خیلی زیاد بک‌گراند داستان رو خوندم، خیلی در موردش هر منبعی رو وجود داشته جستجو کردم و وقتی تمام این قطعات رو کنار هم گذاشتم، تمام این اتفاقات رو کنار هم گذاشتم، به یک جوابی رسیدم که فکر میکنم بزرگترین جوابی بود که من برای این سوال داشتم و اون سهل‌انگاریه و اون بی‌دقتیه.
I did a great deal of background research and investigated all of the sources that were available to me and about the fire of Cinema Rex. And what I was able to piece together was a feeling of being unmoored or confusion.
گاتفری، من همین روزا که داشتم فیلم رو پرزنت می‌کردم برای فستیوال، یک حادثه‌ای در بیروت اتفاق افتاد. یه انبار مواد منفجره اونجا منفجر شد و نصف شهر رو به باد داد. من خیلی یاد سینما رکس افتادم وقتی این حادثه اتفاق افتاد.
The recent explosion in Beirut last fall, as I witnessed that happening, it very much reminded me of the incident of the fire at Cinema Rex.
وقتی اونجا توی اون حادثه راجع به حادثه بیروت حرف میزنن، باز همین اتفاق میفته. بعضی میگن که یک گروه سیاسی و بعضی میگن یک گروه دیگه سیاسی توش مقصرن، اما جزئیات اون روز در حادثه چی بوده؟ شاید این جزئیات رو وقتی آدم کنار هم بذاره یه پازل بزرگتر رو بتونه بسازه.
When people talk about the Beirut explosion, they once again point to different political factions that may have been responsible, but we haven't really delved into the details of that day. If we piece together those details, there might be a third option to look at, a third explanation.
I see.
اون نوشته‌هایی که اول فیلم میارم فکتای کاملا واقعیه. باور میکنین ماشین آتش نشانی وقتی به محل رسیده آب نداشته. وقتی که سینمادارا وقتی رفتن بیرون سینما رو قفل کردن به خاطر اینکه شب میخواستن برن بخوابن. اینا یه مجموعه اتفاقه که باعث میشه که رکس تبدیل به یه فاجعه شه.
The text that I display at the beginning of the movie depict true facts about the incident. When fire trucks arrived on the scene, they didn't have water. When the attendants left for the day, they locked the cinema up so that they could get rest. And it was all of these small details, these oversights that led to this being a truly tragic event.
Yes, and I know this, that you follow the history in having 4 men responsible for this, a team of 4 men who went into the cinema to set the fire. And also one survived. You have this character's name, Takbali, in the film. I think there was a real guy named Takbali Zadeh, and he was executed after the events. He was blamed for it. What did you find about the real history of this that intrigued you enough to put it in the film?
میدونین در مورد دادگاه سینما رکس مجموعه فیلم هایی که توی دادگاه گرفته شده تمام اینا وجود داره و من تمام این چندین ساعت و چند روز فیلم های دادگاه رو همه با دقت دیدم.
There's many hours of video recordings of the court proceedings of the Cinema Rex incident, and I reviewed all of this very carefully and scrutinized these videos very carefully.
همینطور عده زیادی از آدم‌هایی که در اون دوره در ساواک بودن بعد به بیرون از ایران رفتن و گفتگوهای زیادی در مورد اون حادثه انجام دادن. من اونا رو هم گوش دادم.
I also reviewed the interviews with former Savak agents who were present at the time, many of whom have left the country now, and paid close attention to those to the details shared in those interviews as well.
همینطور بعضی از کسانی که در ایران درگیر این حادثه بودن بعداً در درجات بالایی گرفتن و تونستن توی دولت کارهای انجام بدن. اونا هم در این مورد اظهار نظرهایی کردن و اونا رو هم گوش دادم و مجموعه اینا رو کنار هم چیدم.
Many of the other people who were present and involved with the incident at the time remained in Iran and now hold or later on went to hold very important public offices and held high ranks within the Iranian government. And they have also spoken out publicly about that day and about that incident. And I also reviewed all of that information and all of the information that they have shared publicly very closely and tried to tie all of these narratives together.
مهمترین حرفایی که به نظر من در مورد این حادثه وجود داره حرفایی که خود تکبلی زاده در دادگاه زده. فکر میکنم که اون تنها کسیه که داره در مورد حادثه صحبت میکنه و به نظرم داره تنها ویویی که در دل حادثه بوده رو داره به ما میده، نه تفسیر نمیکنه حادثه رو از جای مختلف.
But I think the most important recounting of that incident that exists is the testimony that Takbalizadeh provided in court himself. He's the only one who recounts the incident from what he witnessed and experienced in the moment rather than through analysis or a certain perspective.
هرچند که حرفای اونو تو دادگاه هیچ کدوم از این دو گروه سیاسی دوست ندارن و میگن که اون داره دروغ میگه.
But it's important to note that his testimony was brought under question by both of the political factions that were also involved in these court proceedings, and they accused him of lying. They did not support the testimony that he provided.
And he was a drug addict, right? And that's in a way how he got into this situation, as you show in the film.
بله اون مواد مخدر استفاده می‌کرده، یعنی معتاد بوده، ولی قبل از اینکه این حادثه اتفاق بیفته اعتیادشو کنار گذاشته بوده. یعنی تصمیم گرفته یه انقلابی بشه و به خاطر اینکه تصمیم گرفته بود انقلابی بشه مواد رو کنار گذاشته بود.
He was an addict, but before the date of this incident, he had stopped using drugs. That was driven by his decision to become a revolutionary, and in order to be able to take on that role, he had stopped using drugs and was no longer an addict at the time.
I see. Shahram, Iranian cinema has been known for a long time for making films that deal with cinema itself, and yours is in a very distinguished tradition. But it's also, it seems to me, very different from things that have come before, because here we have two stories that are going on kind of parallel, and in a lot of cases you would see a film where there's reality and then there's fiction. In this case, it's very hard to tell that one element is real and one is fictional. I mean, obviously there's cinema on both sides of this divide. One audience is watching a film called Careless Crime, and they're indoors, and yet it can't be real because you have these people that are doing something that was done in 1978. And then the other audience is outdoors, and they're watching a film called The Deer, which is a real film by Masoud Kimiai, that was the film that was being watched at the Rex Cinema. Tell me how you came up with this idea of having these stories that are kind of intersecting, and yet neither one of them seems very real. They're both cinematic in a way.
یکی از ایده های اصلی که من در مورد فیلم ساختن فیلمی درباره سینما داشتم از فیلمسازی میاد که شما خیلی بهتر از من اون رو میشناسید و اون عباس کیارستمیه. من فیلم های عباس کیارستمی رو از این ویو که فیلم هایی درباره سینما هستن همیشه نگاه میکردم و اونا رو خیلی دوست داشتم. فیلم های مثل کلوزآپ، زیر درختان زیتون یا چیزهای از این دست رو.
One of my central ideas about making a film about cinema was indeed inspired by Abbas Kiarostami. I've always been a fan of his films, which focus on and depict stories about cinema, including, I'm sorry, Shahram,
Close Up.
Including Close Up and
و زیر درختان زیتون, under the
olive trees. Through the olive trees, yes.
Yeah. منتها من خیلی اگر اون طبقه پایین سالن سینمای فیلم من رو پوسترهایی که به اونجا هست رو اگر یک تماشاچی ایرانی که آشناس ببینه میبینه که همشون فیلم هایی هستن که در سینما ایران درباره سینما ساخته شدن، مثلا سلام سینما از محسن اخملباف.
If you notice the posters that are depicted in the film in the cinema lobby, they are all films that have been made about Iranian cinema, including Salam Cinema by Makhmalbaf.
اما من توی این فیلم میخواستم یه نگاهی به تاریخ بندازم، هم به تاریخ سینما هم به خود تاریخ، و به جای اینکه اون رو پارت ببینم و تکه تکه ببینم، اونو یک پیوسته ببینم، در یک جریان پیوسته ببینم.
But I wanted to examine history in this film, both the history of cinema and history in the traditional sense, and look at it more holistically rather than individual parts.
ما هر وقت در مورد تاریخ حرف میزنیم انگار داریم راجع به یک بلوک‌های جدا حرف میزنیم، میگیم قبل از انقلاب، بعد از انقلاب، مثلا تقسیم بندی اینطوری میکنیم، ولی من فکر میکنم که این یک جریان یه تیکه و پیوسته است.
When we talk about history, we divide it up into blocks of time. For example, before the revolution and after the revolution. But I don't see it as divided parcels of time. I see it as a continuous progression of time.
به خاطر همین میخواستم اون 4 نفر حرکت کنن و از دل یه داستان تاریخی بیان و به یه سینمایی در امروز برسن، به یه سالنی در امروز برسن.
That's why I wanted the four individuals to travel through time and emerge from a historical cinema to modern day cinema.
Okay. No, go ahead.
و داستان موشکی که روی پرده سینما میبینن برام مثل حوادثی شبیه حادثه سینما رکسه که ممکنه امروز هنوز با بی احتیاطی اتفاق بیفته.
The story of the missile that you see on the cinema screen in the film, for me, is very akin to the incident at Cinema Rex, which could happen in modern day with the same sense of carelessness.
Right. Tell me a little bit about how you developed this idea. Once you got the initial idea, what kind of process did you go through yourself and with your co-screenwriter to develop these two different stories and figure out how to interweave them?
همونطور که میدونید من 3 تا فیلم آخرم رو با سناریوش رو با نسیم احمدپور با هم می‌نویسیم و یه پروسه برای خلق کردن اینا داریم که به یه جور پاسکاری میمونه، یه جور رفت و آمد سناریو میمونه.
As you know, my most recent screenplays, the last 3 indeed, were co-written with Nasim Ahmadpour, and we've developed a system that is very collaborative. It's very driven by exchange between the two of us.
ما خیلی متمرکز بودیم روی این ایده که راجع به تاریخ داشتیم فکر می‌کردیم و حوادثی که در تاریخ داره میفته و فکر می‌کردیم که آیا شکل فرم اجرای یک اتفاق در تاریخ، شکل بیرونیش، آیا میتونه به ما همه چی رو راجع به ذات اون حادثه، راجع به درونیات اون حادثه بده؟ به چنین کانسپت کلی داشتیم فکر می‌کردیم.
We were very conscious of the fact that we are depicting history and talking about history, and focused on this idea of whether the way an incident is chronicled in history and depicted through time in history truly represents the inner workings of that incident at the time that it unfolded.
می‌خواستیم ببینیم اگر یه واقعی رو به کسی که تاریخ رو نمیدونه و فقط اون واقعه رو بهش نشون بدیم، آیا اون میتونه به یه برداشتی از اون تاریخ برسه بدون اینکه راجع به اون خونده باشه یا بدون اینکه راجع به اون اطلاعاتی داشته باشه و فقط با دیدن بتونه بفهمه که این یه ایده تاریخیه، درباره تاریخه.
We were keen to discover whether if we presented an incident to someone, a historical incident to an audience that didn't have knowledge of that history, didn't have knowledge of that incident, what conclusion could they come to solely from the way the incident was depicted in our work?
از بین تمام اتفاقای تاریخی ماجرای سینما رکس برامون جذابیت بیشتری داشت به خاطر ارتباطی که با سینما پیدا می‌کرد و فکر کردیم اینو باید انتخاب کنیم.
From all of the various historical moments or incidents we could have chosen, the incident of the fire at Cinema Rex was most appealing to us because it was related to cinema and centered on cinema.
Right, but you set the scenes of the recreation of the Rex cinema incident. It looks very contemporary. Did you consider setting it in the past in 1978, and why did you make it contemporary instead of that?
این ایده از اینجا اومد که ما فکر میکنیم که یعنی توی سناریو موقع نوشتن سناریو داشتیم این فکر میکردیم که هنوز این درسته که ماجرای سینما رکس تموم شده، اما ماجراهای مشابه ماجرای سینما رکس هنوز داره اتفاق میفته. یعنی شاید ما با یادآوری کردن داستان سینما رکس بتونیم بگیم که مراقب حادثه‌های مشابه در همین الان باشیم.
When we were writing the screenplay, we decided that even though the Cinema Rex incident happened in the past, it has parallels to modern day incidents, and that by setting it in present day, we could really highlight those parallels.
یه جور هشدار دادن راجع به این که هنوز فرصت برای اینکه جنایت‌های بی‌دقتی اتفاق بیفته هنوز هست. هنوز این پرونده ها بازن.
It's a type of warning to point out that there's still an opportunity, there's still a likelihood that these types of careless crimes can unfold in modern day.
Right. Talk a little bit about the visual style of the film, because you have two different styles in the different sections. In the section that is set in the theater, it seems a cooler, more realistic kind of style, whereas in the other story up in the hills, it's more of a movie-looking style. It looks like a classic movie. How did you decide to use those two styles in contrast to each other?
خیلی خوشحالم که این نکته رو با این دقت میپرسین و راجبش میگین، چون برای ما خیلی مهم بود این که این دوتا استایل با هم دیگه متفاوت باشه و تماشاچی رو حس کنه.
I'm very happy that you noticed this aspect of the film, Godfrey, because it was very important for us that the viewer notice and experience the difference in these two styles.
فکر کردیم که برای بخش قدیمی‌تر استایل مدرن‌تری رو انتخاب کنیم با دوربینی که فالو شات میکنه کاراکتر رو و نزدیک تکبلیه و از اون جدا نمیشه و فکر کردیم این بخش رو اونطوری بگیریم و به جاش فیلمی که روی سینماست که داستانش در امروز داره اتفاق میفته رو با استایل کلاسیک تری توی سینما دنبال بکنیم، با دوربین هایی که روی ریل حرکت میکنن و یه ترکیب بندی های کلاسیک.
بخش قدیمی یه استایل مدرن تر.
بله، بخش قدیمی داستانی که قدیمی تر بود استایل مدرن تر و فالو شات و دوربین روی دست.
So we decided that for the older parts of the story to use a more modern treatment, a handheld camera, tighter framing, and for the more modern day aspects of the story, a more traditional treatment, cameras that are on rails, working continuously.
خیلی دوست داشتیم دوربین همیشه نزدیک تکبلی باشه توی اون بخش و صورت اونو بزرگ توی قاب داشته باشه، اما در بخش فیلمی که روی پرده است از لانگ شات ها و منظره های و لندسکیپ ها استفاده بکنیم.
We very much wanted the shots of Takbali to be closely framed, feel very tight on him, keep him tight in the frame, whereas the parts of the film that depict the story on the screen are much more widely framed, much more of a landscape treatment.
You know, it's interesting that your first two films were all done in a single take, and here you've gone to cutting between two different stories and also cutting within stories. I think it still feels like your film very much. It still feels like your style, even though there are cuts and between stories and within stories. What did you think about in doing that and making that transition from one style to this style? Like I say, it seems very natural progression for you.
خیلی تصمیم سختی بود برام، خیلی. فیلم ساختن توی یک تیک مثل تجربه‌ای میمونه که آدم وقتی انجامش داد دیگه دوست نداره ازش چشم بپوشه و یه دنیای تازه‌ای رو جلوی آدم باز میکنه. خیلی سخت بود که بخوام یه مدل دیگه فیلم بسازم.
It was a very difficult decision. Making a film in one take is an experience that once you've lived it, you never want to look back. So it was very hard for me to convince myself to do it differently.
روز اولی که رفتم سر فیلم برداری و گفتم که کات و یه سکانس رو فیلم برداری کرده بودیم اما هنوز فیلم تموم نشده بود و من باید میرفتم خونه و دوباره فردا میومدم بقیه‌شو میگرفتم. سالها بود اینطوری به فیلم‌ها نگاه نمی‌کردم.
The first day on the set, when I called cut, we had finished one sequence, but the scene was not done yet. And it was very hard for me to accept the fact that I had to go home and come back the next day and pick up where we left off. I hadn't thought about filmmaking in that way for many years.
باید دوباره برگردم وان تیک بسازم چون که اون مدل فیلم یه خیلی هایپر میکنه منو، فکر کنم نمیتونم ازش جدا بشم.
I think I have to revert back to making films in one take, because that type of filmmaking is very exciting and makes me very hyper, and I just can't let it go.
Well, that's good. I also want to ask about the sound, because the sound is very unusual, and I really like the way that you use things like sound effects and things that could be music or could be sound effects. It really helps heighten the tension within these scenes. Can you talk about how you came up to use these techniques in making the sound?
کسی که ساوند دیزاینر ما بود در فیلم جنایتی بی‌دقت، پرویز آبنار، اون همون کسیه که در 2 فیلم قبلی ما با هم کار کردیم و خیلی همدیگر رو خوب میشناسیم و خیلی دقیق میدونیم که چیکار باید بکنیم روی صدا.
Parviz Abnar, the sound designer for this film, worked with me on my previous 2 films as well, and we know each other very well. We understand each other very well and know what we need to do to present the sound the way it needs to be in the film.
ما بعضی وقتا نگرانی نیستیم که دیالوگای خوب شنیده میشن یا نه، یا اینکه توی صدا برامون خیلی مهمه که اتمسفر غالب باشه، اون ایده اصلی باشه، تا اینکه بخوایم نت همه چی رو خوب بشنویم. و فکر میکنم این ریسک بزرگیه برای یک کسی که کار صدا میکنه و پرویز خیلی خوب این کار رو با من جوینت شده و میتونیم خوب انجامش بدیم با هم.
Our main concern isn't that the dialogue be pristine, it's that the atmosphere be at the forefront of the moment. And this is a very risky undertaking for a sound designer, but Parviz is very comfortable with it and supports me in making that happen.
Also, I wanted to ask about the way you work with actors, because it's a very, very distinctive style I think you have. Do you involve the actors early on in your film? Do you rehearse much? And how do you choose them? It seems like you must have an instinct for good ensemble playing, because you need people to work together in a particular way in both of these stories.
من بازیگرام رو از همیشه دنبالشون توی تئاتر میگردم، یعنی توی تئاترهای ایرانی میگردم. فکر میکنم که اونجا بازیگرای خوب و زیادی وجود داره که هنوز وارد صنعت سینما توی ایران نشدن و به نظرم خیلی فوق‌العاده هستن برای اینکه تو بتونی باشون تمرینای طولانی بکنی.
I search for my actors on the theater stage. I feel like Iranian theater has very strong actors who have not yet been discovered by the cinema industry, and they're actors whom you can work with very intensely and rehearse with for long periods of time.
ضمن اینکه اونا برای طولانی مدت اجراهای طولانی مدت، یعنی منظورم دیوریشن اجراست، آموزش دیدن و به خاطر همین نگرانی نیستم که توی لانگ نماهای طولانی با اونا کار بکنم، لانگ تیک های طولانی باشون کار بکنم.
Most importantly, these actors have been professionally trained for long performances. They have endurance and stamina for long performances. So there is no concern about working with them or them performing in a long cinematic take.
Right, right. Has the film come out in Iran, and if so, what kind of reaction has it gotten?
ما هنوز فیلم رو توی ایران نمایش ندادیم. مدت چند ماهی هست که منتظر اون اجازه نمایش فیلم در ایران هستیم، اما هنوز اون اجازه صادر نشده و ما نتونستیم فیلم رو توی ایران فعلا نمایش بدیم. البته من امیدوارم که اون مجوز رو بتونیم بگیریم، اما فعلا هنوز نه.
The film has not been screened in Iran yet. We've been waiting for several months for the permit to be issued to grant us permission to screen the film in Iran. I am hopeful that the permit will be issued, but it has not happened yet.
Is there any problem from the point of view of the people that issue those permits? Do you think?
راستش خودم هم کنجکاوم در این مورد بدونم، چون که من برای فیلمنامه فیلم مجوز اون اجازه ساخت رو گرفتم و عین فیلمنامه رو اجرا کردم، یعنی همون فیلمنامه که اجازه براش گرفتم و اجرا کردم، ولی قابل پیش بینی نیست این چیزا. گاتفری، شما میدونین در مورد سینمای ایران این نکته رو خودتون که خیلی قابل پیش بینی نیست. باید برم توی اون جلسات ببینم. امیدوارم اینطوری نباشه.
I'm curious to know the answer to that question as well, Godfrey. I had a production permit for the screenplay, and the film that I made very closely mirrors the screenplay that was approved. But as you, of all people, know well, Iranian cinema is not predictable. So I'm keen to see how this will play out.
Well, good luck with that for sure. We have a couple of questions from the audience, so I'll read those for you. First one is your first feature, Fish and Cat, seems like a horror film. Your second film, Invasion, feels like a dystopian thriller. Careless Crime seems somewhat less tied to a specific genre. Do you approach new projects with the intention that they'll adhere to a particular genre or not?
ببینید من خیلی راستش به سینما، به هر آنچه که توش اتفاق میفته علاقه دارم. میدونم که فیلم بعدیم دوباره نزدیک به ایده های ژانره، اما نه به معنای این که نزدیک به ایده های مثلا هارور مووی یا اسلشر مووی باشه. دارم روی ایده‌ای با تم سینمای پلیسی، جنایی، معمایی دارم کار میکنم، ولی اونم باز یه فیلمیه که نگاهی به سینمای ژانر داره.
I'm very passionate about the genre of cinema in general, and I'm experimenting with a concept that could be characterized as a crime thriller, but once again, it ties back to cinema as a genre.
Right. And the other question from the audience is, what film have you seen recently that has inspired you? Can you tell us about other filmmakers besides Kiarostami whose work you admire?
در ایران، منظور فیلمساز در ایران، درسته؟
نگفتن در ایران، کلا گفتن فیلمسازای دیگه که ازشون الهام میگیرین.
من در سینما ایران کار بعضی از فیلمسازها رو خیلی دوست دارم. مثلا کیانوش عیاری یکی از کارگردان‌های مورد علاقه‌مه و همینطور سینمای اصغر فرهادی رو فکر می‌کنم یه ایده‌ای جدیدی رو وارد سینما ایران می‌کنه.
I'm a big fan of Kiarostami Ayari. He's a very strong filmmaker. I'm also a fan of Asghar Farhadi's work. It's unveiling some new concepts in filmmaking.
و اما در سینمای جهان اگه بخوام بهتون بگم باید یه لیست خیلی طولانی و بلند بنویسم. امسال فیلم مورد علاقه‌ام مثلا فیلم فرست کاو بود. فکر میکنم که توی تاپ 10 هم اون قرار، توی بالاترین فیلم لیستمون باشه.
But if I were to speak about global filmmakers, global cinema is a very long list. This year, one of my top favorites is First Cow.
Oh yeah, great. She's a friend of mine, and she'll be happy to hear that. Yeah. I really like that film. Yeah. Somebody else is asking, has your movie got a distribution in the US or Europe at this point?
ما توی اروپا پخش کننده داریم، هم در فرانسه و هم در سوئیس، آلمان و ایتالیا. و خبر خوبی که امروز قبل از این Q&A داشتم این بود که داریم با یه پخش کننده در آمریکا صحبت میکنیم و خیلی امیدوارم که به زودی ما بتونیم این برای فیلم پخش کننده داشته باشیم توی آمریکا. حتی ممکنه سه‌شنبه.
So in Europe, we have distribution in France, Switzerland, Germany, and Italy. And just today, I learned that our negotiations with a distributor here in the United States are well underway. And I might have news to share about that as soon as next week, next Tuesday.
That's fantastic. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Also, there's one other question here about something that I was curious about too, is the reason for having such a loop, a direct and repeated loop in that one scene in the mountains where they keep saying the same lines over and over again. That doesn't happen anywhere else in the movie, I don't think. But in that scene, it's very interesting. What was the reason for that?
دو تا دلیل دارم براش. یکیش اونیه که دلیل اولش رو یه ذره با مثلا طنز میخوام بگم، ولی در جواب اون همون چیزی که شما بهش اشاره کردین، میخواستم یه جای فیلمم دوباره یه کاری شبیه فیلم‌های دوتا فیلم قبلیم بکنم، یه لانگ تیکی که همه چی رو توش به هم بریزم.
So So there are two reasons for that. The first one is a little tongue-in-cheek humor. Somewhere in the film, I wanted to throw back to my last two previous works and depict something in a long take.
و دلیل دومش اما برام اینه که یه جور به خود ارجاع دادن شاید بتونم بهش بگم. یعنی میخواستم بگم که چطور ممکنه ما یک پیغام از دل تاریخ سینما بفرستیم و اون کاغذ رو بذاریم تو جیب تکبلی. مسیر این چطوری ممکن اتفاق بیفته؟ یه جادویی که در زمان اتفاق میفته. میخواستم اون سکانس معرف چنین اتفاقی باشه.
The second reason is perhaps I wanted to find a way to send the message from the annals, from the chronicles of cinema, of history, directly to Takbeli, and it was an attempt at some wizardry to make that communication between these two different time periods, these two different aspects of cinematic history happen.
اون سرباز از دخترها میپرسه چطور کاغذو جابجا میکنین، جادوتون رو به من نشون بدین و اونا یه پلان پیچیده بهش نشون میدن. میخواستم بگم کاغذ اینطوری جابجا میشه در تاریخ سینما.
The soldier asks the girls, how do you move your piece of paper? And they show him a very complicated undertaking. And I wanted to make the point that this is how a message, this is how a missive travels through the history of cinema.
Good. I have just a couple of more questions before we wrap up, Shahram. First of all is what are the conditions like in Iran now for filmmaking? Can you just say a little bit about that? Is it very difficult now due to sanctions and these other difficulties, or are people just carrying on?
ببینید میتونم بگم هم ساده و هم سخت. فکر میکنم که توی ایران از موقعی که تصمیم میگیرید یه فیلم بسازید تا موقعی که اون فیلم رو میسازید زمان خیلی کوتاه‌تری رو طی میکنین تا مثلا در اروپا یا در آمریکا. اینش خیلی ساده است.
So I can say it's both simple and complicated at the same time. In Iran, the time period before when a filmmaker decides to make a film or comes up with a concept to when that film arrives on the screen is a much shorter time period than what filmmakers in the United States or the West experienced.
توی اروپا و آمریکا من تجربه که الان دارم فکر میکنم که فیلم ها توی پروسه 3 ساله قرار میگیرن، ولی توی ایران این پروسه 1 ساله از لحظه‌ای که تصمیم میگیرید تا موقعی که میسازید.
So based on my own experience making films in Europe and the United States, I can say that the process for filmmaking here in the West unfolds over the course of on average 3 years, where that same process in Iran takes no more than a year.
اما بخش سخت ماجرا همون چیزیه که شما هم میدونید، این که تو همه فیلم ها رو نمیتونی، همه فیلمنامه ها رو نمیتونی بسازی، این که بعد از اینکه فیلم تو ساختی معلوم نیست بتونی اونو نمایش بدی، این که فیلمنامه ها چطور ممکنه مجوز ساخت بگیرن. یه بوروکراسی که خیلی بوروکراسی پیچیده ایه، باید راه‌هاشو بلد باشی که بتونی به مقصد برسی.
But the challenge is that in Iran, you can't make any screenplay. Once a screenplay has been approved and the film is actually made, there's no guarantee that it can actually be publicly screened. There's a very complicated bureaucracy surrounding filmmaking in Iran, and you really have to know the ins and outs of that bureaucracy well in order to be successful in navigating it.
Right. And just the final question, what's in the future for you? Do you have a next project already planned or underway?
بله، من همین روزها در حال نوشتن سناریوی جدیدم هستم. همون سناریویی که گفتم، امیدوارم یه فیلم سناریوی پلیسی خوب باشه و خیلی امیدوارم که سال بعد بتونم اون رو بسازم. فعلا این داستان در تهران داره اتفاق میفته و البته یه پیشنهادی برای کار در آمریکا دارم که هنوز در حد پیشنهاده و نمیدونیم که چطوری داره پیش میره. آروم آروم باید پیش بره.
Currently, I'm writing a new screenplay, the one that I mentioned to you earlier, a crime thriller, and it's currently set in Tehran. I'm hoping to be able to begin production on it next year. I've also been in discussions about a project here in the United States, but they're still preliminary discussions and are progressing slowly.
این سال بعد که گفتم منظورم سال بعد ایرانی بود، یعنی مثلا 8 ماه آینده.
And when Shahram mentioned next year, he meant the next Iranian calendar year, so in 7 or 8 months.
Okay, great. Well, Shahram, it's great to talk to you and great to see you again. I hope I'll see you before long in Iran one day. And good luck to you on your films between now and then. And congratulations on this one.
منم خیلی ممنونم و خیلی خوشحالم که شما هم دوباره دیدم. امیدوارم دوباره این بار در تهران هم دیگر رو ببینیم. منم مشتاق اون قرار قبلیمون هستم که دوباره تکرار شه.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure to be here, and I too hope that we see each other once again in Tehran and can once again experience our former agreement and former arrangement back in Tehran.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you very much, and good night, everyone.
Thank you.